Reporting. Yep. Awesome. All right, guys. Welcome to the Brisbane Azure User Group. I did update that. So, welcome to January 2026. That was lucky. Before we get going, big thank you out there to our sponsors. So, Codify. So you don't have to say anything. Thank you very much, and Microsoft. Thank you very much. So, without these guys, this would not be possible. So, we really are grateful for everything that these guys do, and it's amazing to see that support. Being a community group where we're really keen to get people involved in this, we want everybody to be involved. It doesn't matter about your skill levels at all. So we've got a bunch of openings, and we're starting to fill up for the year. If you've got experience with Azure, we would love to hear from you. So it doesn't have to be the newest and greatest thing. Sometimes it could just be what works in your environment, what works for you. We just want to hear your experiences. We want to share that amongst the community. We want other people to hear what's good, what's maybe not quite so good. Just generally, how did you go? So got a few spots. If you're keen, let us know. Got a spot there. Flick us an email, and we'd love to hear from you. So a few updates this month. Not as many. We've just had some big things recently, and people are just getting back to work. So, but a few things that have been happening. We got Azure Cosmos DB mirroring in preview. So that's where you've got the Cosmos database. You want to, bring that through. It's now in public preview. It's working with the virtual networks. You can bring that into your Fabric workspace, and it's mirrored directly into Fabric. So those people that are using Cosmos for applications and you want to get your data into that big data environment, this is a great option. And with the virtual networks, you can keep that safe. So that's pretty cool. We've got Service Bus Premium geo-replication. So that went into preview a while back, but it's now gone GA. So that's where you're replicating those service buses into another region. Currently, if it's region, you have to choose. It's that pair, but does the hard work for you. So that's good. Azure Premium SSD V2. So is now available in Australia East. Normally, I don't pick up too much of this. Good catch. I'm blind, so now available in Austria.
My bad. West Austria. How exciting is it too now that there is an Austrian region? So when you get the drop down,
The trouble is Austria East, isn't that Russia?
Hey, don't tell anyone. Right. All right, let's move on. That one's anyway. Storage Mover. So that's come out a while back, but we now have Storage Mover blob to blob migration. So you can migrate between subscriptions or in the same storage account between different containers. So that's a migration capability that you've now got in Azure. That's pretty much it for this month. A couple of resources that we normally plug. So, you've got the YouTube channel. This will be on the YouTube channel, the training, the blogs. And tonight, without any further ado, I'm going to introduce you to, for those of you who don't know Bernie, I'm pretty sure everyone does know Bernie. But anyway, Bernie, our gracious host, who's here every single Azure group, we're very thankful for you, is now going to talk about infrastructure as code for 2026. So welcome, Bernie.
Good.
Alrighty. Yeah, so today we're going to talk about infrastructure as code and Bicep, and really some stuff that then is sort of just been evolving over time. So you may be across it, you may not be across it, but then also a bunch of new stuff as well, and also some of the maybe the finer details, which if you don't actually go looking for it, it might be a little bit hard to find, or it may not be apparent how to use it and how to get value out of it. So Bicep, for anybody that's completely new to Bicep, maybe throw your hands up if you have used Bicep before. A bit over half maybe. So that's good. There's a lot of people that maybe haven't had a chance to get into it before, which is great. This will definitely give you a bit of a primer on what's happening and what to expect. It's an infrastructure as code language. It's developed by Microsoft. It uses declarative syntax to basically deploy your Azure resources. And really, I guess, this sort of becomes your, way to deploy resources to Azure in a consistent manner. And the whole idea is obviously resources change and update over time. So when you need to make changes to them, you update your code, you re-push your pipeline, away you go, right? So Bicep is production ready. There's heaps of official learning paths and content, lots of MVP content, lots of other people just on YouTube and blog sites writing about Bicep. So there's a lot of community coverage that then you can use to actually learn Bicep if you haven't used it much before or starting to look at what Bicep can do for you. It's regular improvements and fixes. So really, I guess the rate of change of Bicep is sort of good in terms of that there's always new features and bug fixes coming out. So pretty well as you start to get, if you do get issues that are bugs, then they get pretty well fixed generally pretty quickly in my experience anyway. And regular improvements, but also then the team behind Bicep is actually the team who manages ARM, the actual API engine as a deployment infrastructure that then does your deployment. So if you're writing ARM templates or if you're clicking in the portal, all of that is using basically the same infrastructure that the team that write Bicep is responsible for, which is great. But it also means that they're super aware of things like breaking changes as well. So I think we've got a pretty good track record in terms of using Bicep over time, since it's been, I guess, around for maybe 3 years or so, maybe even 4. But in that time, there haven't really been like any significant breaking changes that have really blocked people or anything like that. If you're using experimental features, then sure, there's been a few tweaks on the way. But generally, I think that then it's released stable, and even though it's sort of been around for a long time, the team have been really cognizant of the fact of breaking customers and breaking existing code that exists. So it just works. Active community, MVPs, and PG support. So the product group actually run typically a monthly call where they actually just invite people in the community to basically sit on the call. They often show off new capabilities that they're working on. They often actually ask the community, this is what we're thinking. Do you think it's a good idea, right? Or how would it be useful for you, right? And they use that to prioritize their workload. So they're very engaged. So I have links for those things. So if you're interested in those calls, stay tuned for the resources at the end. And so I guess some of the reasons why you'd want to use Bicep, It's got really rich resource and type discovery. So this is really helpful from an editing experience perspective. And also it starts to help a lot with like when you're using AI and things like that to generate code, which you can absolutely do. But just as an author of Bicep code and things like that, it makes it a lot quicker to actually develop because you very rarely need to go ahead and copy and paste strings or copy something from the documentation. For the most part, things just start to populate. And some of the magic behind that is that it's generated from the REST API specs, which then makes it pretty accurate as long as the team that's responsible for that resource have good API specification, which they generally do, but we're not perfect. Reusability across small, large organizations. So you can absolutely scale Bicep significantly. I've worked with quite a few large and small organizations rolling it out. And so it works quite nicely for pretty well organizations of all size. Pre-built patterns. So I'll talk more about AVM briefly. We have had talks in the past about AVM, which stands for Azure Verified Modules, which is basically a set of Microsoft supported patterns and building blocks that you can basically adopt. And this helps with common things that you want to deploy to Azure without writing all the code yourself, right? And so the benefit of that is that it has a lot of best practices and things like that baked in, so you don't really need to think about some of those things as much. Code scanning and linting for recommendations as well, right? So, why you wouldn't want to use Bicep? Obviously, if you're doing, things across other clouds, then Bicep's not really targeted at that. Also, if you want to manage on-premises infrastructure, again, probably both of these technically you could do with Bicep. I'll explain a little bit more with an experimental feature, but it's not designed for that. And there would probably be quite a lot of heavy lifting, significant amount of heavy lifting you need to do to make it work. But technically, you could do it if you really wanted to, but that's not what it's designed for. Cool. So new features. So some of the, I don't think it's slide, did I? No. So new features. So MCP support, Visual Code. So this obviously helps with some of the AI generation of the code. There's a new snapshot feature, which we might show as well, which allows you to actually go ahead and look at what your code and the resources that it would actually deploy. And then you can actually take a snapshot over time and compare that. So you can do things with, like if you wanted to use it, you could use it for things like PR analysis. Also, if you're consuming modules from, other teams or third parties, then it also makes it much easier to see what are you actually deploying as opposed to just a reference to that external code, which is pretty cool. There's a feature called local deploy as well. So I think all these features that are on the new features are all experimental currently. So I'll show you how to turn them on via feature flag. But again, they'll get released at some point. So local deploy is it's an extensibility capability in Bicep, which then allows you and pretty well anybody to write a binary that then, or use a binary that somebody's already written, and then basically allow Bicep to call that binary to do stuff, right? So it could be to run a script before you start a deployment or the start of a deployment. It could be to generate passwords for a key vault. It could be a whole bunch of things. I've got a list of community extensions, which I'll show as well. So you can sort of see some of the things that are already out there. Parameter validation. So before Bicep did have some, or ARM templates really it came from, and then to Bicep, some ability to do things like allowed lists and things like that, and basic validation around range of integers. Now you can actually do much more sophisticated validation, which sort of gives you quite a few additional toolkits, particularly if you're generating modules or patterns that then would be shared across an enterprise. So you can do validation when those compile. Bicep console is basically a way you can use Bicep interactively if that's what you want to do, or you could use tools. You could combine it with like external tools that then reference the Bicep console to basically generate output and get output back from Bicep in sort of real time. And then there's a new deploy command as well. So previously, when you're deploying your infrastructure as code, you'd often use the AZ CLI to go ahead and deploy a deployment of a resource group or subscription. And so the new deploy feature is actually a feature of the Bicep CLI command as opposed to using the Azure CLI. And so this provides some additional capabilities going forward, or it will as it expands out. But it also has support for deployment stacks as well, which also has some additional lifecycle management around your deployments, which is pretty nice. And we'll have a brief look at that as well. So, any questions before I jump into the next bit? So, reusing modules across the enterprise. So, like I sort of mentioned before, there's something called Azure verified modules, which then basically provide us blocks and patterns for building Azure. They've been around for a reasonable while now. I feel like it's maybe like 2 years that they've been around, and they've evolved significantly through that time. A lot of standardization. So when you go ahead and write infrastructure as code for your organization, you're going to want to do things like spin up virtual networks. Maybe you're using a hub and spoke type architecture, or maybe using private endpoints and landing zones and things like that. You don't have to rebake all that. That's actually available as a Microsoft supported standard module, which is fully open source. So if you decide that, hey, let's just go ahead and copy that and then start from there, perfectly fine. Or alternatively, you can basically just reference it and then basically plug your parameters in for how you want to name things and things like that. Override just the bits that you want to, and away you go. So this obviously significantly reduces, setting up an initial infrastructure, which something like Azure landing zones could be reasonably complicated, right? There's quite a lot of effort to get something like that up and running from scratch. So you don't have to build it from scratch. You can leverage those. The benefit of this is that they are constantly evolving, but you can go ahead and pin to a specific version that then works for you. But also then there's been a lot of validation that's gone into the process of getting them ready to release in the first place. So they align to well-architected practices and things like that. So a lot of the security that you need to typically be concerned on is like on by default. So it becomes a much more safer, easier place that then you can start from, as opposed to knowing all the things that you should turn on or off to get started. Cool. So, and then another thing that you can also do from an enterprise perspective is if you do have patterns that then are specific to your organization, you can go ahead and put them into a container registry and then effectively go ahead and then distribute them across the organization. So you might have a scenario whereby maybe as a large organization, then you maybe have a central team that then is developing standard patterns and practices. Or maybe you're a small organization where you have a few standard things that you need to deploy out to your environment, and you want to make sure that again you're not reinventing the wheel every single time. And also you want to have some of that consistency. So again, you don't need every developer to know, I've got to turn on TLS or whatever. It's just done by default. So again, you could go ahead and just consume the AVM patterns if they suit your needs. Or you could go ahead and build your own modules or copy the AVM modules and then put them in a standard registry that then your organization private to you can consume across everything they do, right? And so this generates quite a lot of reuse. And this would be a potential model that you might use. Cool. So that's some of the basics out of the way. Let's jump into some demos. make sure. Cool. So I have a repo, and I will provide a link at the end for the repo and also all the links to the resources. So don't feel like you need to screenshot everything, but feel free to if you want. Let's get started. So basic resource creation and consuming modules. Let's just do a few basic examples to get started. So let me throw in a new file, and then we'll do a demo. Cool. So we've got our code editor open. I'm using Visual Studio Code. You can also use Visual Studio if that's what you prefer. I believe there was another editor coming out at some point, but these are the main ones that then are used. If we want to go ahead and deploy a storage account, we can do resource, storage, and then if we basically just type storage account, we'll find an account there. And you can sort of see as I'm going through this, I do a lot of like enter, space enter, or whatever. It picks up, here are all the API versions that are available for a storage account, right? I do equals space, and then it says, hey, here are the required properties. Yep, well, they're required, so I need to put them in. So I can go ahead and put a name in. Let me just go ahead and create a few parameters first. So param name, string, param location, string, equals resource group dot location. So I want to go ahead and put my storage account in the same location as the resource group. So name and location. Cool, I've got SKU. We'll just populate that for the moment. LRS. Cool, so that's one way I could create a storage account, sort of like the default minimum required storage account, which potentially might have some problems in terms of the default security. So then I could also go ahead and do module and then use storage AVM, and then I'll use basically VR public, and again storage, right? And the top one here is a storage account. And again, similar experience. Hey, here are all the versions of the AVM module that are published currently. Similar required properties and just a name. It's cool. I can just plug in name there as well, technically. And so I guess that's the basic experience building a resource, right? In that, I've already parameterized two things, would pretty common to parameterize name and location, potentially. But obviously we can go much more nuts with that. Again, if I want to see what are all the other parameters available, I can just, let me just turn on screencast mode. I can do control space, and that will then go ahead and show me here are all the things that I can configure. You'll notice as well, once you start to like hover over them as well, it'll give you like information such as, hey, here are the options, here's the description. Again, if I choose something like, let's try, and we can try a kind here. But again, if I space, you'll again see here are all the options that are available. So this is a module, just like you can build. I can actually even go ahead and go to it. So I can, if I hover over the name here, go view documentation, that'll take us to the GitHub page where it's all open source with the README, right? Which is being linked there specifically. But then if I go into the main Bicep file here, might just slightly zoom in, potentially. Can everybody see that okay? Worse. Maybe another zoom. But again, you can sort of see here is effectively what's there. And again, you can sort of see here somebody populated kind with here are all the available things, right? So this is just the exact same tools that you can use, right? It's just basically being put on a container registry, similar to that diagram that I showed before. They have a repo, they push it to the container registry. It's a public registry that anybody can access. And it does have a special like position within Bicep because it's known as the public registry. So from that, it's basically already built into Bicep. You don't need to configure it, but effectively you could do something similar with your own Azure container registry that you've deployed in Azure. It wouldn't be public, of course, because it's a private registry. And then you can basically set up the configuration file to point there, and then you've got basically similar type experience. Cool. And so the reason why you sort of see some of this information, again, is because descriptions have been populated and things like that. And that's pretty well how it works under the covers. I can also go ahead and I think it's control click, and it will actually go ahead and like open the code because it actually has it's downloaded a copy, which is sort of like in the user preferences when you reference it. And it's basically pulled that down. So that's basically the code from the repo at that version that I referenced, which was 0.310, right? Which is pretty cool. So let's just populate that briefly because I did just want to sort of show something in terms of we sort of mentioned that, hey, well, maybe there's a difference in security around both of these two because one has best practices built in and one doesn't, or one has one's been aligned to the WAF framework and one hasn't. So if I go ahead and run PS rule, which is basically, I'll go into a little bit more detail, but effectively it's a tool that we can run across our code to go ahead and check those well-architected practices. We should basically get, and there will be some errors from the AVM, we'll see what they are, but you'll sort of notice there'll be a significant difference in what they are. But I will say that I did turn off one specific rule about tagging, which has been excluded. So that won't appear, although technically it is a failure. There's the use resource tags. Yeah, so while we wait for that to go, does anybody have any questions at this point or any thoughts? All good? Might let that go in the background just briefly, and let me go ahead and check. Yes. So that hopefully this also starts to set the scenes around, hey, I'm building some infrastructure as code. Now we want to then start to we've already referenced the module. We can also reference as other modules that are on the same file system. So we can basically go ahead and reference that. I think this is oh, sorry, I didn't put a name in there. Yes, that's not gonna reference. And while that goes ahead, then so we've got our storage account there. We can also go ahead and reference the modules in the same repo as well. So storage local. So I have, you can sort of see there's a completion going back up directories. So I actually have a modules folder up in the root of my repo, which then also has a storage module in it. And which I can also go ahead and complete. So main.bicep. And again, I could also consume it that way as well. but that's okay. I'm not going to do that. But so again, building code together and building modules is pretty well. So a module is really just the same Bicep file somewhere else. So I can easily reference files together, merge them together, and away I go. I already covered like at a high level. Here are some parameters and things like that. There's also variables and things like that we can also use, and also a bunch of functions, which some of it we'll get into. Some of it we won't, but that should give you a bit of an understanding. But we can also go ahead and when we're actually starting to consume this, say, for example, let's just check. So we've got one failure here, storage account. And that's, again, storage account is actually set, local auth is not enabled. So I think that's what the issue is there. I think that's probably maybe because I think I made an error there. I should have actually called them different names. Storage, ABM, because we should see both. I'll just do that. But when we're creating modules, again, similar to what's been done from the Bicep public registry here, we want to make them easy to use. And so there's a lot of tools that we have at our disposal today that have sort of been evolving over time that make that super easy. So to sort of get into some of them, let me go ahead and just create a new file. And we'll just call this, oops. Cool. So we may want to, or let's go back to here. Now we'll just reference our module from here. So module, and so at the moment we would have some parameters that we can specify. So we've got name and location, which we deployed over in our deploy.bicep. But we might want to be a little bit more specific around some of the additional configuration that we need. Because again, those are fairly basic, high-level things. We got one warning before around, we've got 8. We can sort of see the storage AVM has 12 out of 13 rules passed, and then the default one had 6 out of 13 pass. Quite a few other things that weren't enabled by default. So say, for example, we want to go ahead and use something like configure local, no, maybe that's the best. Let's try something like authorization, because that's a little tricky. So typically when we're using a storage account or any other resource, we need to provide access to it. In AVM, for example, we have role assignments. And then again, this is just a parameter that somebody defined. It's also got acquired properties. And again, we go ahead and have a look at some of these options. There's a whole bunch of things that then have existed. And so somebody's actually defined what these things are. So to do something similar in any of our modules, we can actually go ahead and create a custom type, which then makes it easier for when people consume it. So if I go to my custom types here, which I prepared earlier, you'll sort of see here that then, again, this is just calling a module that I built that's in this repository. We've got 2 params that we might be interested in, cores and assignments. And so by going and entering in on that, we can see the required properties. And now it's going to basically populate all the things out that are required. Again, I can go ahead and control space, and it will allow me to specify headers. I can also go ahead and see here are all the allowed methods. and I could actually see them specifically. And so how I've done that, if we actually go ahead and jump into that module, it's over here. Go to cause, find cause. We can actually define basically cause rule type. So if I go ahead and just control click on that, it'll take me to the definition. And here I actually can specify, again, this is all user defined. What does core rule type actually mean? It allows me to go ahead and specify, I've got an array of allowed headers. I've got allowed methods. I've got allowed origins. Some of them have validation on them, some of them don't. This allowed methods obviously is a specific list of here are all the allowed methods, which is why when I control spaced on it, it basically populated here are the list, right? And again, because it is an array, I can go ahead and control space here and then add one and do the next one, right? And so on and so forth, right? And so custom types have been a huge like improvement to the way like Bicep works. And again, if you look at other potential infrastructure as code languages, you may not necessarily have the rich capability of some of the stuff that you have here. It's pretty well like a significant improvement on some options out there for sure, right? And this is all, again, thinking around how can Bicep be a really good experience for users, and also it makes it a lot faster too. We know immediately what are the required properties we need to specify, and we can control space to effectively complete what they need to be, right? For a lot of the cases, obviously it depends on if you're building modules, it depends on how much effort you put in terms of the validation. If you're consuming modules, then a lot of that stuff is baked in from the AVM, but obviously it's going to improve as well over time. But this gives you a bit of an idea on some of the things that you can do. If I go to I'll go back to maybe that other module over here, so storage. So you can sort of see there's like a few options there in terms of defining type. It's also possible to define, again, these like separated, type separated options obviously are one of. You can also go ahead and specify like question marks, which then make them optional. So you'll sort of notice with the cause, may have been some there. They're all required. But if I did want to sort of make this like optional, then I could do that quite easily like that. And then again, let's go ahead and save and jump back. If I deleted that and control space again, required properties, it's not there anymore, right? So pretty fast to get that up and running. And again, I've got descriptions on all these as well. So again, it doesn't take a lot of work these days because AI will probably fill in the description for you. You've just got to say add description and let it do its thing. And you've got a description, which then obviously makes it a bit easier for people who are consuming it. So yeah, custom types, super big. It makes a huge difference to how we work. And extending on that as well, there is basically the ability to consume other types as well from Azure itself. So say, for example, we go back to our deploy Bicep here. Maybe we want to go ahead and maybe this kind is something that we do want to configure. Or maybe the SKU, maybe that's a better option. We want to configure the SKU. So we're building this module because we want people to consume a storage account how our organization wants to deploy a storage account. So we can put in kind because we do want that to be, or let's put in SKU because we want that to be configurable, right? SKU, it'll be a, and then we can actually use a resource input, and then we can actually say, well, give me all the options that are available to this particular type. This one's slightly easier to copy and paste because I've already got it there. And then we can dot and sort of say we want the properties, no, sorry, SKU. SKU. Cool. Move the angle. Okay. And again, now when I go to have and consume that over in params, I go ahead and choose my SKU, and then it's basically going to automatically know what all the required properties are, right? Because I'm just basically reusing something that's already defined in Azure in the spec at that specific version of a storage account, right? Obviously, new storage accounts might have different versions, but I said, hey, these are the options that I want to specify. Which sort of makes it sort of easy because you don't then have to start redefining stuff that then if you just want it configurable as Azure has provided, you can basically just import that as a type and go away, right? Cool. Supporting language elements. So this is another pretty cool feature that's been around for a little while now, but is constantly improving. So we can actually define like common elements that then we would use, such as functions, types, constants. Technically, they're not constants, they're variables, but we can import them in to other code. So say, for example, we want to have a function that then names a storage account, right? Because we don't want everybody to consuming. We don't want everybody to specify it. We want to do it in a standard way. Then we can actually just define a function, export it, and then people can just import that, call the function, and it names a storage account, right? Pretty straightforward. Again, I guess the basics of that are that we basically give it a name, we tell it what the parameters are, and then it's sort of slightly off the screen here, but let me go ahead and turn on word wrap. But then we use the equals angle bracket, and then we say, this is the function, and this is what you do with that, which basically just interpolates it and then returns a string, right? And if I go back to my deploy over here, I can now effectively do that. I could go, if I want to go up here, I can go ahead and import. I can say, that will auto-complete in a sec, but I can say from and then go up a few directories because it happens to be in this repo, choose modules and pull in func, and then null space here and storage account name. I can then reference it over here and sort of say storage account name. And again, it will then ask here all my arguments, right? And away you go. Subscription. Source group. Dev, and then dev, and one, right? And we'll basically go ahead and generate that storage account. Similar, we can go ahead and do that with our types, right? So like I was sort of saying before, we've got our custom types. Maybe we have to assign RBAC to things a lot. Well, we could actually just reference that as a type, right? If we wanted to, or we could potentially just import the Azure version, but maybe we don't want to for whatever reason because we want to constrain it in some way. Maybe we don't want to allow, foreign group or device as a thing that people can select. So we could just delete it, right? And provide this as a custom type instead. Really, whatever you want, right? You can also, again, change some of the behavior as well. Cool. So custom types, import, export, pretty amazing. Again, you could also use like your constants to sort of say, here are all the standard prefixes or suffixes for resources. You can effectively go nuts on that. Cool. And the cool thing about that as well is that when it actually goes ahead and builds the template, it actually and does the deployment, it actually pulls that into the to the template and the deployment seamlessly, and doesn't actually require a reference going forward on that, which is pretty cool. Parameter files and extending parameter files. So parameter files in Azure have been around for quite a while. Bicep has its own take on it, and you're probably familiar with it if you've been using Bicep. Maybe less for me if you haven't. But if I go ahead and create a, let's just call it dev.bicep param. So our parameter file effectively is going to complete any parameters that we want to have for our module, our deployment, our reusable code. So we'll then obviously specify the name or the environment or whatever it is that we need as far as our deployment is concerned. So the way we do that is basically by using. We specify, hey, we'd like to use deploy to Bicep. And you sort of see it starts to complete some of that. Some of that's not 100% accurate with what I'm currently using at the moment. But then we can do param, we can specify the location, name, SKU. Again, for SKU, we should have all the required properties, because again, it's all auto imported, so standard RS. And we'd obviously complete any other mandatory properties, which SKU is the other properties were all defined anyway. So we can do it like that. And then this allows us to then parameterize and say, here's the specific instance of that module that we'd like to deploy. But you can actually even further extend on that now as well. You can actually go ahead and create parameters that then build on top of parameter files as well. So maybe you have like a base standard, and then you want to then extend that further. So maybe we want to call this instead, maybe we want this to be like, we'll just call this LRM or something like that. And then we can go ahead and use a new file and call that dev. And then we can now go ahead and extend that. And then just specify here is the specific thing that we want to override or whatever, right? So in this case here, I think we need to just go ahead and so I need to enable that. So this is a good place to go ahead and talk about the Bicep config. So in this case, the extending parameter files is an experimental feature. So we've got a Bicep config JSON file that allows us to basically configure a few things about Bicep. One of them is what experimental features are on or not. So if we want to go ahead and enable extendable parameter files, effectively that's how we do it. We can also go ahead and configure a few other things, such as how we're going to talk to Azure from a deployment perspective, and things like other container registries where we want to pull in modules as well. We might come back to that, but let's go back to our dev Bicep, and now we should be able to, I think, that we need to using deploy, right? And then we can then go ahead and define and then effectively override the parameters that we want to write. So in this particular case here, now we can go ahead and specify the name of our storage account. Or whatever. So now we can then define a module and then actually go ahead and create stacked configurations as well if we need to. It probably is a fairly advanced scenario that you're probably not going to encounter in a lot of cases, but definitely this provides a fair bit of additional flexibility because we can also go ahead and do things such as when we go ahead and define these, we can actually go ahead and import from environment variables as well. So we can read environment variables, and we may not want to do that in all of the configs. So we may create a separate param file that then basically pulls in environment variables or ones that might have certain defaults in them as well. So again, provides a little bit more flexibility about how you actually deploy it. Yeah, I guess any questions at that point? Yeah, go ahead.
From me, primary cases like user levels of access, how does Bicep handle configuration drift? If someone goes and changes a description or adds more users to the storage account, for example, is it tear down? Is it tear down and replicate? Does it do a delta?
Yeah. So that's it's a great question. So how does Bicep handle like ongoing changes over time, particularly for things that might be like problematic to update and things like that? So there's a few different ways. Most of them are not Bicep features. There are some capabilities in Bicep, such as don't recreate a resource if it already exists, which now is an experimental feature, which is helpful for some specific scenarios. But in most cases, that's actually handled by deployment stacks. And so deployment stacks is basically a lifecycle management around the deployment. So basically you push a stack the first time, and then effectively when you go ahead and push it again, it'll go ahead and sort of say, hey, these things used to be there but aren't anymore. So potentially get rid of them or disconnect them from the rest of the deployment. So you've got a choice on whether you want to clean them up or just like exclude them, leave them there, but exclude them from the deployment going forward. And so that gives you some options. It also allows you to tear it down as well, which is also a good option. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Cool. So we've got some pretty cool abilities there. So read from environment variables is pretty good when you're trying to do it from a deployment pipeline or anything like that. And basically you just effectively would sort of say, here's my environment variable name, whatever, and away we go. It's got a red underline there because I don't have that variable name, but if I did, then it would be fine.
Sorry, just carrying on from that, you mentioned earlier on there's a new feature, snapshot.
Yes.
Can that be sort of similar to used similarly or
Sort of, yeah.
State configuration?
Yeah, so it's a great segue. I will actually come back and do something on stacks, but we can show how it works for the snapshots. So we've got our LRS Bicep param. Let's go ahead and copy that relative path. So there's a and fine. Let me just expand that there. So Bicep snapshot, and then basically throw your file in. I don't think there's any Visual Studio Code like integration yet, but maybe there will be in the future. And effectively, when you run this command, it's going to then generate a JSON file next to it. So again, how you integrate this or how you use this, it's sort of like a reasonably low-level tool, but depending on, I guess, how you want to present that within a pipeline, it gives you a fair bit of flexibility. But again, it's experimental, so hopefully it will improve over time. But you can sort of see here, it has effectively predicted here are the resources that I'll deploy based on what I've configured. Some of the stuff it's populated, some of the stuff it hasn't populated. So for things like subscription ID, it didn't know what it was when I ran that command just then. so it didn't actually populate that. And same with the resource group name. But anything that I did, it did know, such as it was environment dev and 01, it automatically did that and populated that in and replaced the string. Again, also SKU as well. I think I referenced it there, right? I didn't actually reference it there, but let me just go ahead and put SKU in, right? So it'll automatically populate that in the oops, it should be skewed like that. Skew. It'll automatically like populate that, but you can also go ahead and for some of the more environmental things, such as subscription ID. So I'm just doing -- subscription ID. I'll just put ABC in, which is not a valid subscription ID. But running that now, it will basically go ahead and then start to actually populate that. Like now, ABC is like automatically replaced in there. So obviously, for some of those things that are more specific to where did I actually deploy it, you need to provide that information for it to fully resolve that information. But if it can, it will fully effectively resolve it, right? Which is pretty cool. This gives you an idea of what would actually be deployed given input. And so snapshot, again, there's probably lots of ways it could be used, but one of the, I guess, the key ways to use it would be to go ahead and I think there might even be like a HTML version option, but basically the idea would be this would be attached to a pull request or something like that. So you run your pipeline, you go ahead and run the snapshot command, you push that as a comment back into the pull request and sort of say, hey, this is what's going to be as a result of the change. If I saved this into my repo, I could actually do a what if compare against like the previous snapshot as well, right? If I don't necessarily have to save it into the repo, but I need to at least potentially save it somewhere so that I can do a comparison between them. And then you can sort of do effectively, hey, Bernie made this change. Here's what he's suggesting. Here's all the code like you'd normally get in a pull request. But then you could obviously go ahead and post back a comment onto the actual thread of the pull request saying, okay, well, here was the actual diff in the code, and here's the resulting resources that are changed, right? So it gives you a fair bit of flexibility. Again, it's fairly early in the stage in terms of that you don't actually get like that pull request update functionality like out of the box or anything like that. But how you want to integrate it into your CI/CD, it gives you flexibility, right? Yeah. And so, yeah, there's basically the snapshot. There's also a verifier, which then basically does the comparison between the two. So I think if I go ahead and do something like this here, change that to blob storage, just like that, and then do Bicep snapshot, and then you change that to validate. Double check. So all these experimental options, they are in the Bicep registry. So let me just go and I'll show you how to get to it. Because unfortunately, some of these CLI commands, because they're experimental, they don't actually have any help that you can just do -- help. So if you don't remember what it is, then not always super easy. But if you go to the Azure Bicep repo and then you go to experimental features, and then this sort of tells you like all the feature flags to enable and what they do. But then there's more detail in here around what they actually do. So if you go to experimental, and then if you go to snapshot command, and snapshot. Oh, mode validate, sorry. It's still the snapshot command, mode validate. And then validate. So you can sort of see there again, pretty fairly easily. I only changed one thing, so it's obviously nice and clear, but you can sort of see sort of like a what if against here's the file that I had, and here's the change that I made, and I made one change, and we can sort of pretty clearly see that. So obviously the bit now is obviously currently on you to then go ahead and take that and put that into a PR and do that. Which can be done with automation, but I'm sure at some point someone will just have a tool that you can just do it and it'll be nice. Cool. Awesome. Let's go back and see what else we need to cover. Extended parameter files. Yeah, cool. So we've got that. Let's talk about linting briefly. So the linter, probably over time in the last year or so, the linter has got really, really good at a lot of things, and a lot more security stuff has been baked into the linter. So I guess what you need to know is that by default, the linter is on. You can completely change almost most aspects of it in terms of toggling things on and off. You can't really customize the linter, although technically there is a way to go ahead and build your own linting rules. It's not very easy, and it's not very well documented either. So generally, for the most part, you would actually be looking at analyzers in your Bicep config. And then if you go ahead and control space, then basically here are all the linting rules. And you can go ahead and effectively turn them on or off, right? So just level and then choose whatever. In terms of what the defaults are, it's in the docs in terms of here are all the defaults and things like that. But if you don't like defaults, then you can basically change them. You can also go ahead and override the linting rules on a per line basis. So say, for example, going to one of my modules, I'm pretty sure I have one, this one. Yeah, so basically you can go ahead and do this hash disable next line, and then basically the linter rule ID. It'll automatically populate that. So if I take the example that I had before, which was the hard-coded location, let's go ahead and, I think it's a warning by default, but let's make it an error for whatever reason. If we go into our Bicep over up here in our demo, deploy, and we decide that we want to go ahead and set this to, I don't know, Austria East. Then it should go ahead and sort of start to complain.
You didn't choose Austria.
I didn't choose Austria. Oh no, sorry. That rule actually isn't related to the parameter because that's actually not hard coding. It's complains about when you put it here, right? So again, zero it out. If for, and again, this is probably not one that you do want to turn off, but if you did want to, you'd go hash disable next line, and it will actually automatically know that, hey, the linter rule on the next line is currently erroring about this. So it'll basically just, again, autocomplete for you, right? Which is pretty cool. Again, these ones up here, these are all like warnings because the parameter is not used. If I, again, wanted to override that on this specific instance, then I can obviously do that too, right? And away we go. Yeah, so that's, I guess, the linter. Again, it's been rapidly evolving over the last year. there's a lot of good security related things that it's been more aware of like how you're passing secrets, are you trying to hard code secrets and things like that. It should basically go ahead and error or warn on certain cases like that, for sure. And then the other case is around the PS rule stuff that we were looking at before in terms of the best practices. So that's a PowerShell module that we can use within our pipelines. So jump back here and I'll jump to this one here. So I guess one of the things that it does is it does things like security best practices, like we're talking about. It'll sort of know, hey, you haven't set like TLS, and there was a few other errors that came up before when we ran our storage account. It'll know about that, but we can also use it to like also enforce your naming and tagging. So this is a new feature. Previously, it used to be a CAF module that was more aligned to that, but now it's actually just been all put into PS rule for Azure. So that is now has not everything, but has quite a lot of rules that we can actually configure. So the naming rules, because again, organization naming is all very specific. It's not on by default, but if we want to go ahead and turn that on, we can effectively go ahead and if we go to our storage naming, go ahead and get this. This is basically the configuration value name. Value name. And so if we wanted to sort of go into our ps-rule.yaml, we can go ahead and set configuration. Instead of say, here's the name format, and we actually then just give it a regular expression of what we want to do. So that gives us a lot more flexibility. Previously, under the CAF option, it used to be like it was just a prefix. So it was fairly inflexible, but now we can actually do full naming. Go ahead.
You're being unduly modest here, but can you embed PS rule?
Yeah, so PS rule is an invention of mine. So I'm showing it, but I guess be aware that that's the case. Yeah.
In 2021, I had to do that stuff manually with code review, and when you watched your first presentation, I thought, I want that.
Yeah. So yeah, if we wanted to then have everything started with ST, then obviously we could fairly easily do that with a regular expression. Obviously, regular expressions themselves can be a little bit painful sometimes, but it provides the most amount of flexibility because, again, every organization has its own naming standards and requirements. So it's an effective way to do it. Again, there's other examples in the docs around, like if we wanted to go ahead and so that we can also do it around tags and things like that. Like case sensitive RG dash and things like that. So again, that's something that you can extend on. You can also go ahead and add your own custom rules. So previously, you would have to do something around that, like, define your own custom rule for, setting here are the environment tags that you want to set. Now you don't need to do that. You just basically configure it. But if you wanted to do other cases, such as something very specific, such as requiring specific paths of files in a repo, then you can also do that as well with PS rule, which provides a fair bit of flexibility. You can also go ahead and write PowerShell rules as well, which then gives you like much more power because you get to write scripting language. So we can go ahead and do rule. And if we wanted to create a rule for a storage account, we could basically just name the rule, throw in the storage account name format, which is Microsoft.storage. Storage accounts, yes. Ensure that it has no case. Yep, there you go. There's a rule. But we just need to go ahead and lines of and then this becomes target And now we've got a custom role. So again, we can do that sort of stuff as well if you want to do like sophisticated validation. But today there's about 530 rules in PS rules. So there's probably a lot of stuff that you can probably just enable or just use by default. Cool. So yeah, linting, testing, local deploy. Yeah, so local deploy is an interesting one. So I guess probably up until this point, then really, if it wasn't something that was a resource in Azure, and more specifically, like something that had been specifically exposed as a resource provider, and that you could write an ARM template for or call it directly, then it became very hard to potentially manage that with Bicep. You really couldn't do it. But I guess in the world of local deploy, which is an experimental feature, you can go ahead and actually start using things that may not exist in Azure. They do still need to be invoked from a Bicep template, but technically it's just a binary that runs somewhere that does something, and Bicep provides, here are the parameters that go into it, and you know what happens out of that is really completely abstract and doesn't have anything to do with Azure. So let's have a look at what is currently available, and then I'll show you some examples. So this one here. That's wrong. Cool. So basically, this person who is a person in the Bicep community, again, anybody can effectively throw up a GitHub repo. Has just decided he'll start collecting all the local extensions from the community, which is awesome because now we have a nice list that basically sort of says, here are all the things you can do with local deploy. So if you want to go ahead and configure Azure DevOps, there's a local deploy option for that. Azure Entitlement Management, Cloudflare extension, Databricks, GitHub, HTTP, Key Vault, Kubernetes, local script, that's what the local extension is, and then password generator, right? But effectively anybody can build it. Today, so it's not requiring that you do use C#, but the only samples available today are C#, but basically it uses JSON RPC, which is available in many languages, to basically communicate between Bicep and the local extension. And away you go. So if you can write a binary that then it can run, then you can basically go ahead and extend Bicep with whatever functionality that you need, right? All of these are open source, of course, so you can go ahead and jump through and have a look at the code and see how it works. There's also in the Bicep repo over here, there is also some information here about local deploy, debugging, quick start. So if you go into local deploy, it sort of gives you some basics around that. And then if you go to the quick start, it then sort of shows here's how you basically set up your C# project and basically builds your own extension to Bicep, right? So at the moment, none of these extensions are shipped by Microsoft per se, even though technically some of them are Microsoft people that have built them. Some of them are just MVPs or other people in the community. But they're not hosted anywhere, so you need to download the repo and then compile it yourself with .NET Build. And then potentially, if you just want to use it locally, you can just use it as a local binary, or you can also go ahead and push it to your own container registry, as your container registry, and then have your organization consume it. And so once you've pushed it to a container registry, you can basically reference it here. So you basically give it a name, and then you sort of say, here's my container registry, and here's the path in the container registry and the tag that's assigned to. And then when we then go ahead and use that, so in my local deployed bicep, we can basically sort of say, hey, I want to use local, which was whatever I put in my bicep config. And then basically I want to go ahead and call out. So that actually defines the script resource that then previously didn't exist. And so in this particular case here, it can actually go ahead and run a script locally. So this will execute not within Azure, on the pipeline or the user's computer, wherever the bicep deployment process is running, right? And then go on, right? So in this case here, we can run a script. But again, you could sort of see maybe script is probably, it's a very flexible option, but some of the other options are actually pretty useful for people to just get up and running, right? This is easy because it doesn't require any infrastructure. So the way I'm just going to do it is using another bicep feature. So they have, there's a new feature in bicep that you can use from VS Code to basically show a deployment plane. And you can actually deploy things straight from here, but local deploy, you can obviously go ahead and just run. And again, this isn't talking to Azure because I don't have any Azure resources in here. And it'll go ahead and effectively run the script, right? So a few things with local deploy. Because you can't have it, like it's not running in Azure, it's running locally. You can't have like a big deployment and then somewhere down the middle of that deployment call local deploy, because at that point it's running in Azure. But you can go ahead and have like a parent module referencing local deploy and then call a deployment in Azure at a later date. So you can absolutely do that. So this means that you can potentially chain things together, have things like happen on the pipeline computer or wherever that's running, that might be before or after potentially your actual Azure deployment, which is pretty cool, which gives you a lot more flexibility around some of these bespoke things that you might have to do in your environment than you did before. And you can sort of see there, it sort of came back, and obviously I had an output. So in my local deploy, I had an output and basically returned that after running the script, which is obviously a pretty straightforward, just echo script like that. But you know, you can do lots of things with that. Cool. And so before actually doing the talk tonight, I did actually talk to, there's a Bicep LinkedIn group, and I actually posted there about a week ago to sort of say, hey, what were you excited about in 2025 about new? And this was actually one of the most top features because people have been asking for something like this, because this has parallels in tools like Terraform, right? And this makes it pretty flexible in terms of what you could do to then glue some of the stuff that's a little bit hard to glue together, like generating like passwords for virtual machines before they boot up, right? You can do that much easier with something like this. Cool. Yeah, so that's local deploy. How are we going for time? We are almost at 7:30, so let's just see what else we need. I think we've covered a lot of the cool stuff. Let's just go back to the slides and see if there's anything else that then people are really interested in and want to have a bit of a look. Cool. Let me actually, I'll show you from parameter validation because that actually is pretty cool. Validation. So basically, again, it's an experimental feature, but it's already pretty mature at the moment anyway in terms of like its capability and how it works. But basically, we do a add validate there, and now we can basically use normal Bicep goodness to basically go ahead and perform validation on the string, and then provide a custom string as a result to then return as an error. So this will happen when you go ahead and perform a validate, or when you try to deploy it to Azure, it'll basically go ahead. At this stage, it's not available as part of a pre Bicep build type stage, but hopefully it will be soon. But in terms of if you want to go ahead and test that a deployment is good by pushing it to Azure or running the Bicep, the Azure validate options of go ahead and test this deployment, it'll basically be detected at that point, which is pretty cool. It's basically gives you all the flexibility that we really didn't have before. We only had very basic constraints before, which is pretty cool. And Bicep console. So let me just show you that briefly, but Bicep console. Effectively at this point here, then basically you can paste Bicep code in and it will start evaluating it, right? So if you want to do, I equals +3 and output I, then it'll go ahead and do it. So you can basically just copy and paste code. I haven't seen people use this too much yet, but I think there's a fair few good integration options available, right? So if you want to go ahead and if you are maybe building other scripts and things like that around it and actually want to go ahead and do evaluation of, hey, what does this code actually do? Then you can actually go ahead and call the Bicep console, throw the code in, and effectively have Bicep evaluate it through its engine without having to sort of build anything more complex. Cool. And let's jump onto the resources, I think. Cool. So if you don't know the first page, so this awesome Azure Bicep. So this is a awesome. Might actually just jump out of that and do it from in here. So this is a great page that you can use. So again, this is all just community content, which basically has here's all your resources in terms of learn, docs, videos, announcements, repos, community videos, podcasts, pretty well everything that then is known about Bicep for the most part. And obviously people in the community also go ahead and update it. So there's a stack load of stuff. So if you're new to Bicep or you haven't touched Bicep in a little while, or you just want to know everything about Bicep, go here first. Because this is going to really give you an opportunity to skill up and sort of dive into stuff really cool quickly. Azure verified modules. So this is, like I was mentioning, Azure verified modules. We can go to the resource modules list or the pattern modules list, and you can go ahead and sort of see here are all the modules that are available, which is a lot. And it also gives you their locations, and you can go ahead and do pull requests as well to some of these modules as well and improve them. They are managed by Microsoft. So somebody within Microsoft owns them and will approve the PRs or whatever. But generally, if there's any issues and things like that, then the best thing to do is go ahead, log an issue, and then if you've got time, try to go ahead and fix the issue as well, and then raise a pull request. And away you go. But again, these are updated pretty frequently. Some of them will come up as orphaned as well. So sometimes there's a module there, and then whoever was in charge of that at Microsoft either moves role or leaves Microsoft or something like that, and then it becomes orphaned. And so in that particular state, it's not really managed too much. If there's any critical fixes, you can still raise issues, and then basically, if they haven't been addressed for a little while, then you can basically escalate them and get somebody to address them anyway. Yeah, basically they're not as typically up to date, but the ones that are like green generally have some pretty good maintenance around them, and they're addressed reasonably quickly, especially for bug fixes. The Bicep community call. So again, this link is in the repo that I'll show at the end, which also includes the slides. But basically that's an invite. You can sign up, and then Microsoft will send you a monthly email saying, hey, here's the community call. Would you like to join? And you just join via Teams, and you can sort of participate in the community like that. There's also the LinkedIn group. So the Azure Bicep users LinkedIn group is run by 2 MVPs. So it's not specifically led by Microsoft, but there's a lot of people across both the Bicep PG and related to Bicep, but also a lot of good community people, which will also help you out. Local deploy, again, there's some, there is a like fairly detailed blog by Marco about how to go about doing that if you're interested in exploring a little bit more, and the list of extensions that I provided and showed. There's also some links around PS Rule for Azure. And then there's also, so I have done a few sessions at the Brisbane Azure user group before. So these are the ones that are like related to the topic tonight. So if you want to jump into some things specifically around deployment stacks and how it works, there's a video on that, which was a previous Brisbane Azure user group session. And also a few other things that I also talked about tonight, which I go into a little bit more detail than I did tonight. But yeah, that's pretty well it. So this is a link to the repo and the slides, and it also has links to the resources as well as the code that I used tonight. So feel free to take a copy of that, but that's pretty well it, unless anybody's getting questions. Yep, go ahead.
Just curious about the debug cycle for the Bicep deploy, because my colleague is sometimes they find if you if you debug some bug in the staging environment, it's very hard to find. And if you want to redeploy, it take a long time. So sometimes they just go to Azure and modify a bit and see if it works. If it works, go back to Bicep, modify and commit. Do you think it's a good cycle or any other better practice if we use local deploy or some other practice? Yeah,
that's a good question. So I guess the question is, in an enterprise environment, how do you go about like working out what code you should have and modifying code as you need to? So I guess so the approach that you sort of outlined around like trying to debug something in the Azure portal by changing a few settings and then working out that works and then updating Bicep, that works. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that per se. I think for the most part, that works great in dev. Obviously, you probably don't want to do it in higher environments. So for a dev environment, I think that's perfectly fine. Each organization has their own rules about how that works per se. For me, that seems like a reasonably logical thing to me. I feel like definitely you'd want to do that probably in production, because sometimes when you change things in the portal, it's not necessarily immediate obvious of what all the things that had actually changed are. So I think the way to verify that is definitely to, once you get to a higher environment, you should ideally be driving it via code, right? But that's why you have a lower environment in the first place, is to make sure that, hey, the stuff that I'm pushing up to the next environment is actually the good code. So for me personally, but again, each environment and each customer is different, then I would sort of say it's okay to play like within the Azure portal in like development, but then after we start to push to an environment, if something's not right, then we should like modify the code and push it to that environment. That way would be my perspective. But up to you. You can also go ahead and have a very tight loop around your infrastructure as code as well. So you could sort of say, there's a way to basically push straight to dev, straight from your GitHub pipeline as part of like the pull request. So you create the pull request and that triggers the deployment into dev. So I've definitely seen customers out there that sort of say, no touching like the Azure resources directly. We really want you to go ahead and update the code, create a pull request, and then it will trigger a deployment like automatically. And the way you update that deployment is, change the code and then like push the git commit, and then the pull request again action fires and away you go, right? So up to you and in each environment, but I would sort of say I definitely try to keep the code like a direct mirror of what you're deploying into your environment as early on as possible. Yeah. Go ahead.
Kind of a related question.
Sorry.
Yeah, bro.
I will actually I think there was a question over here first. Yeah, go ahead.
So if we're deploying multiple resources and one of the resources is using some properties of the other resource, is there a way we can put some verification before we deploy the next resource in Bicep?
Good question. So can we put verification between resources? Great question. I would say generally no, but there are some cases where that's not entirely true. Verification is probably a little tricky one in terms of when Azure or Bicep goes ahead and deploys stuff. It's like there's a high level of verification that occurs before anything starts, and then when a deployment kicks off, it'll do also some verification. So we sort of didn't go into necessarily all the detail. Some of the other videos that do, but whenever we reference a module, at least today, that's actually it's like a sub deployment. And at that point, then it'll do some verification in between. So depending on what you want to do, you may be able to do some verification at that level, but most of verification happens up front and not in between steps.
So one resource is using some properties of other resource. Is it recommended then to do two separate Bicep deployments and then do some?
Yeah, so if you want to use properties, the easiest way to do that is you want to use properties of another resource. There's actually a fairly straightforward way to do it, which then sort of helps significantly. So say for example, we wanted to do like a web app and it needed to access the storage, right? That's probably a fairly like common case. We could go ahead and like do the web app within this particular storage account module itself, or this parameter validation module that I've got here. We can also go ahead and just output maybe like we want the blob endpoint. So we can actually then just go ahead and like reference it. So storage, and then we do properties and then endpoints. I think it is endpoints. Or on the endpoints and then blob. So we can actually just reference that property, right? And so that's the way, obviously, to make sure that it's correct. And then when we actually reference that with the web app, it'll actually make Azure will actually order the deployment such that if the web app takes a dependency on the storage account, it'll make sure the storage account is fully deployed successfully first, and then it will run the web app, and it will just put the property in, right? So that's the way to do it with my suggestion. I'll come back. Yes.
Kind of a related question to the how do you, could you click through stuff and generate the Bicep you want? Then Databricks has this idea of a Databricks asset bundle. It's essentially infrastructure as code for data engineering tasks. One of the things you can do with that is you can use the GUID to build up your jobs, so conditional logic and what notebooks they call, and then you can export the YAML code of that. They can VS Code and flesh out parameters and bits and pieces.
Yep.
Is there a similar concept or any thought of doing that within Azure to turn your resources back into Bicep?
Yes, yes. There's a few different ways you could do it. I guess the most obvious way is if we go into like one of these resource groups, we can actually just go to, so this is a fairly oldish way, but it actually has some modernization behind it. And I think they've changed it, but you can go export template. And so there used to be only the ARM template option. There's now a Bicep option, so you can just export the Bicep there. The caveat around this is that it can, sometimes it can be like reasonably verbose. So if the intent is to deploy the same resource, it's probably okay. But if the intent is to copy it for reuse, then you may need to sanitize some things.
Yeah.
Another way that's less obvious to do it is, so we can do the same thing for like specific resources as well. So if we go to demo, there's also an option around there for export template, and it works the same. To export a specific resource, we can actually do it also from the Bicep console, from the Bicep editor. If we have the resource ID, there, if you go Control-Shift-P and then something under Bicep, JSON as Bicep, insert resource, right? And you basically just throw the resource ID in there, and hopefully I'm authenticated here. I think I am, but it should just go ahead and like throw the Bicep in there, and it does a little bit of additional sanitization when it does it. Takes a little while. Hopefully it will just work because it's not obvious on what it's doing at this point, but it should just throw the Bicep in there if I am authenticated. Just check. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, so that's basically just thrown it in there. So yeah, those are the two ways to probably do it. I would sort of say that works generally, most people.
GitHub Copilot with MCP works really well.
That's also an option. So there is, so if you go ahead and, I said there's Azure MCP, and then yeah, basically once you've got that, if you like this, so there's a few tools within the MCP server for Azure MCP, and then there's like things here which will basically effectively export the resource. So again, there's a lot of things that are resource specific. And basically the ability to export resources out is one of those things. So yeah, that's a good call.
And then if you've got a repo already with your templates, you can say to it, get the definition it's currently got, but then format it like my other templates, and it'll do that in one go for you.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely.
Like November, December last year, there was a dedicated talk you did on Bicep and MCP.
That's right. Yes, that's right. And so like aside to that, which probably is worth just like calling out as well, which is sort of cool and interesting. Let me just grab like this. So if I've got existing JSON or partial JSON, I don't have a virtual network here, but if I go ahead and just copy, let's just do it for address space. It'll do it for a big block. If I go ahead and just get that JSON and like just, I got it there. If I go ahead and like throw it in like that, except it needs the curly bracket. That's the only thing. If I go ahead and copy that, paste it in, it should. Maybe it's going to tell if oh, no, it's because I've already got it there. That's the reason why. If I go ahead and just, and I did put an extra bracket in there. Maybe I'm just going about it wrong. Let me just, it does require valid JSON. That's why it's having a problem. But if I go address space, So that's also works if you do it correctly. Which is actually pretty helpful, but I will use it less for that. But what it's really good for is, say, for example, I have a list of in this particular context, IP address prefixes for my organization. I'm creating a firewall rule. I get all those, and then I basically just paste them in, and then they've done my array, right? So for that sort of stuff, the copy and paste of random properties that are useful and outside of Azure or outside of the environment is really helpful for stuff like that. Go ahead.
So these, just going back to the deployment stuff, there was some of that on the list. I was hoping you would touch on that. But my question is really, in terms of scope, deployment scope, does the new deployment method sort of deal with that better? Or?
Yeah, that's a good question. So does, I guess, the new deployment stacks option deal with deployment scope? And I would say, yes, it does quite a bit better. Let me close most of this stuff. And so this is local deploy. So deploy command. So this is in the repo. So I sort of mentioned deployment stacks before. Again, I've done a previous talk on detail, but effectively, deployment stacks allows you to lifecycle manage your resources a lot more than what Azure used to previously do. More specifically, it'll go ahead and clean up resources, and it'll also understand the difference between was it part of a deployment previously and what do I do with it. So it makes the teardown much easier. In terms of deployments in general, up until this point, there's no real Bicep concept of deploying something somewhere. It's always just generic code of parameters or a deployment, and then you have to tell it where to deploy when you go ahead and call the AZ CLI, and then that's just how you do it. Now with this, so this is an experimental feature. You need to enable deploy commands. But then now you've got your normal template as normal or your normal module. And then in your Bicep param, there's a slightly different syntax than what I used before on the extensible parameters, where you go with, and you basically say you want to use a stack mode. And then it's basically deployment or stack, right? And then you can actually go ahead and specify the scope. And then you go ahead and pass this to Bicep deploy, and it will actually go ahead and deploy it at that scope. You could obviously hard code these values. In this case here, they're just coming from an environment variable, which you can obviously easily feed through a pipeline or something similar, or hard code them. And again, these are the options that we're sort of talking about before in terms of action and manage. Do I delete the resources? And there's a few options there. So there's delete, patch. And then there's also for management groups resources, again, what do I do? Deny settings. Deny settings is around if you go ahead and push a deployment stack, do you allow that stack to be changed by someone in the Azure portal or some other tool? Or is it hard locked? And you've got different options around deny, delete. There's a few different options: deny, write and delete, or no locking. And there's also options around excluded actions and excluded principles, and applying to child scopes as well, right? So you can sort of say, yes, the stack can't be modified, but then these principles can modify it, right? Or whatever, which might be break glass, or it might be the pipeline itself, or whatever, right? So yeah, does that answer the question?
Somewhat. There's just that, if you deploy, just in terms of best practices or what you've seen in the wild, when deploying to the management group scope, then to the subscription scope, then to the resource group scope, is there you see like a layered approach to those scopes that you
Sure.
separate deployments in like 3 separate deployments, for instance, or do you see in the wild where people use modules to actually create like one deployment but at multiple scopes at the same time?
Yeah. So yeah, I guess as a practice, I've seen like pretty well all approaches there. So like, should you deploy all deployments at a management group level or a subscription or resource group level? I think the challenge there is that it really depends on your environment a lot, and also depends on what you're deploying as well. I think there would be very few organizations that could get away with, here's a monorepo that has all my infrastructure as code and I do one deployment and everything goes out. Because the reality is that there's often like different teams involved. You've got one team over here that are deploying applications or like specific business functionality. And you've got typically in larger organizations, you would then maybe have like security teams, which are then interested in making sure we've got logging and stuff like that for security events, which might be deploying like Sentinel and log analytics and that type of stuff. And then you've got potentially other teams over here, which are then concerned about like core networking and things like that. And so there's like different levels of responsibility, and I think it's very rare to sort of see them all working off a single repo and then have that deploy. And also in a large organization, like if you have one deployment that deploys everything, like that would potentially take a very long time if there's a significant change to run. So you can do it, but typically you would need to, even if you do put it into a monorepo, you'd need to like split up the pipeline so that then it runs like certain sections and sort of flows down, typically speaking. I think generally deploying at a subscription level is probably okay for most scenarios, because if you're adopting something like a landing zone approach, you have a contained area which then the pipeline has principal access to, and then can deploy, and then it can deploy at the subscription level to create resource groups and then shove resources underneath it without any problem. But yeah, I think master deployment that deploys everything is probably unrealistic in most environments, apart from really small ones.
It was really down to creating resources
Yep.
inside a resource group in the same deployment, more for the
Yes.
the use case there.
Yes.
So that you don't blitz out all the resource groups across a subscription and then fill it with resources in separate deployments. So he's saying that it is okay, you know, in
Yeah, it's absolutely okay to deploy a resource group and the resources in it in the same deployment. You may not be able to do that. Where you wouldn't potentially do that is if you have a subscription that's shared with multiple security boundaries within it, or different teams in it that have different levels of permission, because obviously the issue there is that you need to grant permissions to do things typically like creating the resource group is one thing, but then you want to go ahead and set up RBAC permissions and things like that for resources. So if you grant a pipeline access to like something too high, then obviously it's got a big impact area. And so some organizations where obviously you have a subscription that's shared by multiple individual teams and multiple repos serving it, obviously want to reduce the impact area, so then they'll just give a team a resource group itself. But I think generally speaking, with a Azure landing zone architecture, then I would sort of see a reasonable amount of people deploying at the subscription level, and then the resource groups under it are part of the same deployment. Yeah. Cool. Any other questions?
Just like a quick one. So as far as I know, that Bicep is evolving pretty much really faster and in a rapid state. So you reckon in the future it's going to be as standardized as ARMS, or for future reference?
Say that last bit again.
So do you think that it's going to be like the standardization as ARMS, or it's going to be having a different scope for future?
Well, so it's sort of the same thing, right? So like I would sort of say, so like, I guess my difference between like an template and a Bicep code is basically, see it on my screen for whatever reason. Let me just zoom out slightly.
Bicep's kind of the evolution of, like if you're starting new, you wouldn't go with an ARM thing. If you couldn't get away with it, you'd start with Bicep.
Yeah.
It still executes ARM under the hood though.
Yeah, that's right.
ARM's at the resource provider level. It is always ARM.
Yeah, so I just right click on my template and go build ARM template, and I've got an ARM template, right? That's it. That's what I'm the cover. So Bicep really, I didn't probably go into the detail here specifically, but really it's a high level language that basically effectively does the JSON. Obviously, when Microsoft started V2 of Azure, which is the Azure that you use at the moment, there was a version before that called Classic, but basically Azure RM or Azure Resource Manager, which we deploy to now, when that like happened, 2016, I think, was when it was started to basically be GA, basically we started with ARM templates, but the feedback that we got from customers was it's JSON, it's verbose. There are like, in terms of the actual completion within the IDE and VS Code was not too bad because it was based on JSON schema, but there was a lot of other like funkiness that really was just hard to use, right? You couldn't easily just reference things. You had to know what they were called. Yeah, effectively, we took that feedback and we basically decided here's a new Bicep language, which then behaves more like a programming language as opposed to JSON validation, and then provides some of the nice stuff that you expect in a programming language or a infrastructure as code language. And also then created this process where you could easily stitch through different modules, which used to have to be separate ARM templates before. Now you can actually easily stitch them together. Essentially it is that, but now it's just a much better language that then has a lot of flavors of C# and TypeScript and that sort of stuff. So it's sort of taking some of the common like language features that people really like, and it's basically created a language around that. And it absolutely is still evolving in terms of like shortcut features and things like that. But I think today I would fairly comfortably say it's a pretty complete language in terms of like the capabilities, the core language, it's all there for the most part. And now we're getting like more edge cases or just general improvements that will improve the quality experience. But in terms of like, if you compared it to something like Terraform or CloudFormation and things like that, it pretty well has like all the core features that you would expect from a language, right? Yeah. Cool. Well, yeah, thank you for being a great audience. And that's all, thanks. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, appreciate it.
So thank you everybody for coming tonight. Just a couple of things before you leave. So we do have our meeting scheduled next month. I think it's the 11th of February, but it's the second Wednesday as always. And you really don't want to miss this one. It's Todd going to be talking, and those of you who have seen Todd's presentations before know that they're always awesome and very entertaining. So I'm sure this one won't disappoint. Just a couple of things I'll ask you when you leave. One, if you brought in any bottles or cups or anything like that, it would really help if you bring them out. It makes Bernie's and my job a little bit easier to clean up. And also, Microsoft asked if you could please return these. If you really want to keep the card, you can unhook